The sharp sting in Michael Rourke's foot barely registered at first. A former construction foreman turned school janitor, he had long gotten used to pushing through discomfort. A stubbed toe here, a twisted ankle there. Nothing he hadn't worked through before. So when he noticed a sore on the side of his right foot one rainy Wednesday morning, he figured it was just a blister from his worn-out boots. He slapped on a bandage, tightened the laces, and moved on. That was a week ago. Now, standing alone in the locker room after his shift at Rosewood Elementary, Michael winced as he eased his foot out of the boot. The ache had grown sharper, deeper, almost like it was pulsing from inside. He sat down heavily on the bench and peeled off his damp sock, revealing a patch of gauze tinged with a sickly yellow. His fingers hesitated before unwrapping it. When he finally did, he had to fight the urge to gag. The sore had worsened. What was once a small reddish blister now looked like a sunken pit, its edges discolored and its center glossy, as if something under the skin was pressing to get out. Michael stared at it for a moment too long. It almost looked like movement? No. He blinked, telling himself he was just tired. It had been a long week. Long years, really. Ever since losing his wife Lena 3 years ago, life had been a careful balance between grief and obligation. He worked nights so he could be there in the mornings to get his daughter Ellie to school. She was his reason for everything. And at just 10 years old, she had already inherited her mother's quiet strength, though Michael often worried she was growing up too fast, learning to tuck away her emotions just like he did. He cleaned the wound with the last bit of antiseptic he had in his locker and wrapped it again, telling himself that if it didn't improve by the weekend, he'd go see someone. But deep down, he already knew something wasn't right. He didn't say a word to Ellie that night as they ate dinner, microwaved lasagna she insisted on cooking herself, and watched old cartoons like they always did. He laughed when she laughed, even though the pain in his foot throbbed with every heartbeat. 2 days later, the pain became unbearable. By the time he reached the clinic, Michael was limping heavily. The nurse who removed his bandage gasped audibly before excusing herself to fetch the doctor. The wound had changed again, flesh puckered and darkening, strange tiny trails forming just beneath the skin. It looked alive. Dr. Lawson was a kind-eyed man in his 40s, and Michael could tell from the furrow in his brow that the situation was serious. After examining the sore and ordering immediate tests, he gently placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "We're going to take care of you," he said. "But I need to be honest. This is not something we see every day." Michael nodded slowly, trying to swallow the sudden lump in his throat. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for Ellie. The next morning, they called him back in. They had found something that didn't belong in his body. As Michael sat across from Dr. Lawson in a stark white room, the words filtered in slowly as though through fog. Larvae. Invasive infection. Possible environmental source. The doctor was explaining things, but all Michael could think of was Ellie brushing her teeth that morning, humming quietly to herself, asking if they could go to the park after school. He had survived heartbreak. He had rebuilt a life around his daughter. But this was something he couldn't fix with duct tape and quiet strength. This was a new kind of fight. And he knew, with every breath he took, that the only choice now was to face it head on, for her, for Ellie. Michael sat in stunned silence, the doctor's words echoing like distant thunder in his ears. Invasive larvae, an environmental parasite, possibly something contracted through prolonged exposure to contaminated water or soil. Dr. Lawson's voice was steady, calm, but underneath the medical language and gentle tone, Michael could feel the gravity of what he was facing. "How long has the wound been open?" the doctor asked. "About a week," Michael replied, his voice rough, almost hoarse. "Thought it was just a blister. I kept it clean. At least I tried." Dr. Lawson gave a slight nod, understanding but firm. "The infection has already traveled further under the skin. The movement you saw, it wasn't in your head." Michael exhaled slowly and leaned back in the sterile plastic chair. He had seen and heard a lot during his years in construction and janitorial work. Near misses on job sites, friends injured from machinery, families broken by tragedy. But nothing prepared him for this. His own body becoming a host to something foreign, something alive. "I've got a daughter," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We'll do everything we can," Dr. Lawson assured him. "We've scheduled emergency debridement surgery for tomorrow morning. You'll need to stay overnight for observation, and we'll run further tests to determine exactly what species we're dealing with." Michael nodded slowly, his mind already turning toward Ellie. She had school in the morning. Her lunch needed to be packed. She would be waiting by the door with her backpack and that hopeful little smile that always made the day feel worth living. He couldn't just disappear on her. Later that evening, after arrangements had been made, and a neighbor had agreed to look after Ellie for a day or two, Michael sat alone in the hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of machines was the only sound. The pain in his foot had grown sharper, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. It felt like the infection was feeding off of him, growing, spreading. He looked down at the foot now wrapped in fresh gauze, the skin around the ankle starting to swell. He didn't want to look weak in front of Ellie. That had always been his unspoken vow. Ever since Lena died, he had become both father and mother, protector and nurturer, strong yet soft, trying to be everything she needed. He took out his phone and opened the gallery. Photo after photo of Ellie, her first day of school, her toothless grin last Halloween, the homemade Mother's Day card she had given him, insisting he deserved one too. Those images anchored him, reminded him why he had to push through. He remembered the promise he made to Lena in her final days, holding her frail hand in the hospice room. "You keep her safe," she had whispered. "You stay strong for her." Michael had nodded through tears, knowing those words would become his compass. The night stretched on, sleepless and tense. Nurses came and went. Vital signs were checked. And sometime around 3 in the morning, Michael felt a new sensation, a crawling itch just above the ankle. Not a normal itch. It felt deeper, like something was burrowing. He froze. Pulling back the blanket, he hesitated before gently lifting the edge of the gauze. His breath caught. Just beneath the surface of his skin, a faint line was moving. Slowly. Purposefully. Panic surged through him, but he gritted his teeth and pressed the call button. Within moments, a nurse appeared, followed closely by Dr. Lawson. They saw it too. The surgery was moved up to dawn. As they wheeled him into the operating room, Michael held onto a single thought, not of pain, not of fear, but of Ellie, and the sound of her laughter echoing through the house, filling up all the spaces Lena used to occupy. That joy was something worth fighting for, no matter what this was, no matter how deeply it had embedded itself in him. He would not let it take him from her. He had already lost too much. He wasn't about to lose the most important thing he had left. The cold bite of the surgical room, air hit Michael like a wave. He was lying flat, his foot exposed beneath a bright halo of surgical lights, and all around him, masked faces moved with a quiet urgency. Monitors beeped in the background, steady and calm, but inside, Michael's chest felt anything but. He had always been the type to power through hardships, grief, exhaustion, but this was different. This wasn't something he could grit his teeth and endure. This was surrender. This was trust. Trust in people he had only just met. Trust that they would be able to stop something that had already begun burrowing beneath his skin. "We're going to give you something to help you relax," a nurse said gently, tapping at an IV. "Just breathe normally." Michael turned his head and stared at the ceiling, the sterile white tiles fading into a blur. His thoughts drifted, as they always did when things got heavy, to Ellie. She'd be waking up soon, probably wondering where he was. He had left her a note, simple and cheerful, saying he had to go for a checkup and that Miss Carla from next door would walk her to school. He didn't say he was scared. He didn't say it might be something serious. That wasn't what she needed. Not now. As the sedative began to take hold, Michael's muscles relaxed, but his mind stayed sharp, alert to the quiet tremble of fear that had taken root deep inside. He couldn't afford to let it win. He wouldn't. When he awoke, the world was dim and muffled. The surgery was over. Dr. Lawson stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes shadowed with fatigue. "You're lucky we caught it when we did," the doctor began, softly. "It was spreading, fast. The larvae were embedded deeper than we expected. We removed all visible tissue affected, but it's not just your foot we're worried about now. We've sent samples for identification. This parasite, it's not native, not something we typically see." Michael blinked slowly, taking in the words. The pain was dull now, masked by medication, but he could still feel the absence, the rawness where healthy flesh used to be. "Is it over?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "For now," Dr. Lawson replied. "But we need to monitor you closely, and Michael, we think you were exposed through water, possibly the community pool." The words hit like a thunderclap. The pool. He'd taken Ellie there nearly every weekend. It was one of their few happy escapes from routine. It was clean. It was new. He never would have suspected. "She swims there too," he said suddenly, trying to sit up, panic flashing through him. "We've already taken steps," the doctor reassured. "We've contacted local health officials. The pool's being tested. If she has any symptoms—" "She doesn't," Michael cut in. "She's fine, she has to be." But doubt had already cracked through the armor he wore so carefully. He remembered Ellie coughing last week, just a little. He remembered her scratching at her arm and brushing it off. Was it just a bug bite? Had he missed something? The thought of her going through what he was experiencing, he couldn't bear it. The next few days were a blur of tests and treatments. Michael's foot was wrapped tightly, and he was kept under observation. Nurses came and went. His neighbor brought Ellie to visit one afternoon, and the moment she walked in with a handmade card and a worried expression, he forced himself to smile like nothing was wrong. "I just tripped at work," he told her. Being clumsy, she didn't believe him. Ellie crawled up beside him on the hospital bed, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're gonna be okay, right?" He nodded, holding her close. "I promise." But as she drifted off beside him, exhausted from worry, Michael stared out the window at the setting sun and felt the weight of uncertainty settle deep into his bones. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a random infection. Whatever this parasite was, it had found its way into his body for a reason. And if it had come from something as ordinary as a community pool, then others might already be at risk. Ellie might already be at risk. That night, as the hospital wing went quiet, and the fluorescent lights dimmed to a soft hum, Michael made a silent vow to himself. He wasn't just going to recover. He was going to uncover the truth. Where this thing came from, how it got into him, and how he could make sure it never touched his daughter or anyone else again. Because sometimes, being a father meant more than just protecting what you loved. Sometimes it meant fighting a battle no one else could see. The night after Ellie's visit, Michael lay awake in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling. The pain in his foot had dulled to a steady ache, but the turmoil in his mind was anything but still. His daughter's innocent questions echoed in his ears, her soft voice, the worry in her eyes. He couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to brushing this off, how easily he could have written it off as a simple infection and let it get worse. Worse, for him or for Ellie. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and restless. He dreamt of murky water and long, twisting, tendrils reaching toward him beneath the surface. He saw Ellie diving into the pool, smiling, only for her laughter to fade as something unseen tugged her beneath. He jerked awake, covered in sweat, the thin hospital blanket twisted around his legs like a net. He couldn't ignore this anymore. Next morning, while sipping lukewarm coffee from a foam cup, Michael made a decision. He asked to see the test results. Demanded, really. At first, the hospital staff hesitated, but eventually, Dr. Lawson brought him a folder thick with reports, lab notes, and photographs. Michael read through every line with the intensity of someone searching for more than answers. He was hunting for a thread, a clue, something that could lead him to the source. The parasite, according to the pathology report, resembled a species native to Southeast Asia, Gnathostoma spinagirum. It typically infected humans through undercooked fish or contaminated water. But that species didn't exist in Texas, not naturally, not without something or someone bringing it here. Michael's thoughts immediately returned to the community center. Horizon Chemicals had built that place, paid for the renovations, donated the land. Everyone in town had praised their generosity. The way they poured money into local schools, roads, and infrastructure. But Michael had always found it strange how tight-lipped they were when it came to their operations. Most people didn't even know what they produced. They just assumed it was harmless. A memory flickered. 2 weeks ago, before the sore appeared, Michael had noticed something odd at the pool. The water had a faint, oily sheen near the shallow end. One of the lifeguards said it was just sunscreen, buildup. But what if it wasn't? What if it was runoff from something deeper? Something Horizon didn't want anyone to know? Michael requested to be discharged early. The doctors resisted, warning him he needed rest. But he insisted. He had a walking boot now, antibiotics, and strict instructions. He'd follow them, but he wasn't going to lie around while answers were out there waiting. That night, back at home, Michael tucked Ellie into bed and watched her fall asleep, her small hand curled in his. As he looked down at her, that protective instinct, the same one that had kept him going through grief and hardship, roared to life. He couldn't wait for someone else to figure this out. If Horizon was hiding something, if they had introduced a parasite into the town's water supply, then he needed to expose it, before anyone else got hurt, before Ellie was next. The next day, Michael drove to the edge of town, where Horizon's main facility loomed behind a high fence and heavy security. He parked across the street and watched. Delivery trucks rolled in and out. Workers in hazmat suits entered side buildings. A small creek ran alongside the property, barely noticeable, but something about the sluggish movement of the water and the dull green tint caught his attention. Michael got out of the car, limping slightly, and followed the creek on foot. About half a mile downstream, hidden behind overgrown brush and a broken chain-link fence, he found a rusted pipe emptying a thin stream into the water. He knelt beside it, his foot throbbing, and dipped a test kit, one he'd picked up from the pharmacy, into the water. The results would take time, but he already knew. This was no coincidence. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Later that evening, he called Dr. Lawson and shared everything. The photos, the water test, the possible link to the parasite. The doctor listened in silence and finally said, "Michael, if this is true, we have to alert public health immediately." But Michael wasn't sure that would be enough. He had seen Horizon's reach, their money, their power. This might take more than a report. It might take something stronger, a story, the truth, something that couldn't be buried behind donations and press releases. And as he hung up the phone, he realized something else. This wasn't just about a sore on his foot anymore. It was about the whole town. The next morning arrived cloaked in fog, and the entire town of Grey Ridge seemed quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. Michael stood at the edge of his porch, clutching a thermos of black coffee in one hand and the test results in the other. The paper trembled slightly, not from the breeze, but from the weight of what it proved. The sample he'd taken near. The Horizon facility showed dangerous levels of bacterial contamination. Worse, it tested positive for parasitic larvae genetically similar to those found in his wound. Michael stared out at the street, watching parents walk their kids to school, dogs bark from front yards, and joggers make their rounds, blissfully, unaware of the invisible threat pulsing just beneath the surface of their lives. He remembered when his life had felt that peaceful, before the sore, before the hospital, before the questions he could no longer ignore. He had already called the local health department and emailed the lab results to a contact at the state level. But he knew how bureaucracy worked. It would take weeks, months maybe, before anything was done. And Horizon would have enough time to cover their tracks. He couldn't afford to wait. Michael had never been the confrontational type, not since his younger days when grief hardened him and responsibility softened him again. But now something in him had reignited, a quiet fire. If the system wouldn't protect the town, then he would. He drove straight to the local newspaper office that afternoon. It was a small operation, just 2 staff writers and an editor who doubled as the front desk receptionist. The moment he stepped in, the editor, a woman in her 50s named Janet Moore, looked up from her computer and raised an eyebrow. "You're the guy with the foot thing, right?" she said, typing without looking away. "Heard about you from the clinic." "Yeah," Michael said, stepping closer. "But it's not just my foot. It's bigger than that. I think Horizon Chemicals contaminated the water near the community center. I have proof." That got her attention. Janet leaned back, arms folded. "People have been suspicious of Horizon for years, but no one's ever brought something solid. You really have something?" Michael placed the test results on her desk, along with the photos he took of the runoff pipe and the strange residue around it. He laid out the timeline, from his sore to the hospital visit, to the surgical removal of the parasites and how the pathologist had matched it to waterborne infections not native to the area. By the time he finished, Janet's face had lost its skeptical edge. "I'll need to verify this," she said carefully. "But if it checks out, this could blow the roof off this town." "I don't care about headlines," Michael said. "I care about the kids swimming in that pool, about my daughter. This has to stop." Janet nodded, and for the first time, Michael saw a flicker of resolve in her eyes. Later that evening, back home with Ellie, the weight of the day settled over him. They sat together on the living room couch, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched cartoons. She laughed at the screen, unaware of how close danger had come. Michael kissed the top of her head, overwhelmed by the fragile, beautiful normalcy of that moment. He knew things were about to change. 3 days later, the article ran in the town paper, front page, with color photos and medical reports. The headline read, "Contaminated waters? Local father links community pool to dangerous parasite outbreak." It spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, residents were sharing the article online. By the next day, a local news station arrived to interview Michael. Soon after, a state health team arrived in town to begin formal inspections. The community center was shut down temporarily. Horizon Chemicals issued a press release denying everything, calling the claims unsubstantiated and alarmist. But the town was no longer in the dark. Michael received calls from other parents thanking him, sharing stories about their kids having strange rashes or stomach bugs or unexplained fatigue after swimming. The dots were finally connecting. What had once seemed like isolated health complaints now painted a clearer, darker picture. That night, Michael sat at the dining table, going over the latest test results with Dr. Lawson, who had come by after his shift. "You did the right thing," the doctor said. "You might have saved a lot of lives." Michael nodded, but his gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the lights of Horizon's facility still glowed against the night sky. This wasn't over. He could feel it. The parasite might have been the start, but it wasn't the end. 2 weeks after the article broke, the town of Grey Ridge no longer felt like the same place. There was a tension in the air, like a storm just beyond the horizon. The streets still bustled, schools remained open, and businesses carried on. But everywhere Michael went, people whispered. Some offered quiet thanks at the grocery store, or nodded with tight-lipped appreciation at gas stations. Others gave him wary looks as if afraid to be too close to the man who'd stood up against Horizon Chemicals, and Horizon hadn't stayed quiet. Not for long. First came the denial. Then, the pressure. A politely worded cease and desist letter arrived at the local newspaper office. A second one showed up at Michael's house, warning him against making further defamatory statements. Horizon claimed his tests were improperly administered and that his accusations posed a danger to the town's economic stability. He knew exactly what they meant. Horizon employed hundreds in Grey Ridge. They funded the schools. They paved roads. Their money reached into every corner of the community, and now they were turning public opinion. Some neighbors stopped waving. Parents at Ellie's school whispered just out of earshot. At first, Michael tried to ignore it, but when he picked Ellie up from school one afternoon and saw her sitting alone on the swings, a sick feeling rose in his chest. She ran up to him, with a smile, but he noticed the hesitation in her step. "Ellie, sweetie, did something happen today?" She hesitated, eyes flicking to the ground. "Emily's mom said I shouldn't come over anymore." Michael knelt, putting his hands on her shoulders. "Why, sweetheart?" "She said you're making trouble, that her dad might lose his job because of you." Michael closed his eyes, forcing down the anger, not at the little girl, not even at her parents, but at the machine behind it all, the one that turned truth into threat. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, documents spread across the table. He read every word of Horizon's legal threats. They were careful, calculated, designed not to silence with force, but with fear. And it was working. Until a knock came at the door. It was Janet Moore, the editor from the local paper. Her coat was dusted with rain, her eyes wide with urgency. "I got something," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She set a flash drive on the table. "Anonymous source. Claims to be a former Horizon employee. There are files, emails, test results, internal memos." Michael's heart pounded. They opened the files together. What they found chilled him. Horizon had known about water contamination over a year ago. A memo warned that unfiltered waste runoff could carry foreign pathogens introduced during an experimental process. They hadn't halted it. They hadn't even reported it. Instead, they'd increased production and quietly built a secondary runoff channel to dump the excess. But what hit Michael hardest was a report detailing projected containment zones. The community center was listed. So was the public pool. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a calculated risk. By morning, the evidence was in the hands of the State Health Board, environmental protection agencies, and multiple news outlets. Janet published a follow-up article titled, "Leaked Documents Reveal Horizon Knew, Chemical Giant Covered Up Contamination." This time, the story wasn't just local. Regional networks picked it up. Reporters camped outside Horizon's gates. Protesters gathered near the community center, holding signs with Ellie's photo, taken from the original article. Michael watched it all from a distance. He didn't speak at rallies. He didn't post on social media. He simply watched Ellie play in the backyard, her laugh echoing into the sky, and knew that he'd kept his promise to her mother, to protect her, no matter the cost. Eventually, Horizon was forced to suspend operations pending investigation. Several executives were placed on leave. The town was promised a full cleanup and long-term medical monitoring for anyone affected. Michael never considered himself a hero. He was just a father who noticed something was wrong and refused to look away. And as he tucked Ellie in one night, her small fingers curled around his, she whispered, "You stopped the bad guys, didn't you?" He smiled softly, brushing her hair back. "No, sweetheart," he said, voice low. "I just told the truth, and sometimes that's all it takes."